for those of you who I haven't met, I am Gay Ivy, and Maisha Wynn and I welcome you to the second annual Cellmer Morgridge Literacy Research Symposium. Our aim in this ongoing series is to bring to our community the scholars in literacy who have shaped and continue to shape the way we think about literacy, and whose work has resulted in a cascade of related work by other significant literacy scholars around the world. We are particularly focused on researchers who help us to see literate development and literate practices as fundamentally human and social endeavors, and who conduct their research in relationally rich and socially just ways. As always, we would like to express our gratitude to Susan Cellmer and to Tashia Morgridge and their families for making our positions here possible and events like this possible. Thank you so much for joining us this year. I want to turn things over to Professor Maisha Wynn.
Thank you guys so much for being here. We love that we have a full house. I don't think there's a scholar in the School of Ed, certainly the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, who has not been profoundly impacted by the work of Shirley, Brice, Heath. I was just telling her the story, she's had to hear this many times, about being a master's student at Standford in the Language, Literacy, and Culture program, and reading a piece that she co-authored with the historian Elizabeth McHenry about Black writers and readers. And it changed my life as a graduate student. It changed my course of study. It changed the way that I ask questions, the kinds of questions that I knew that I was allowed to ask. So I think in a really important tradition, we have our graduate students introduce our speaker. We have two doctoral students. We have Hannah Graham, who's in her second year here in the PhD program, and we have Fahima Ife, who's in her third year, and they're going to introduce Professor Heath. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so Maisha already introduced us. So I'm Fahima, and this is Hannah.
I'm a second year, and I kind of wanted to open up similarly to Maisha with a little story. So we have the distinct privilege of introducing Professor Heath today. And I want to open with an anecdote that I think speaks to how the scholars and students at this institution regard her work and why this room is so packed. 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to a fellow PhD student here in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and I mentioned that Professor Shirley Brice Heath would be visiting campus. This person, in all sincerity, exclaimed, "Shirley Brice Heath, the rock star?" Thus, Professor Heath, I thought you may wish to know your reputation as a scholar and rock star precedes you here at UW-Madison.
So today we are honored
that
to
is funnier than you can possibly imagine, as Maisha knows.
So today we are honored to welcome Professor Shirley Brice Heath, Marjorie Bailey Professor of English and Dramatic Literature, and Professor of Linguistics and Anthropology Emerita at Standford University, and Professor at Large at the Watson Institute for International Studies, and in the second annual Susan J. Cellmer and Tashia Morgridge Literacy Research Symposium here in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction.
Dr. Heath, a linguistic anthropologist, studies learners across the lifespan in non-traditional environments of learning. She gives primary focus to the ways in which speakers, young and old, learn the structures and uses of language, as well as the attitudes, gestures, and interactional ways called for in learning environments of all types. In community arts organizations, she has examined the learning outcomes that result when youth living in under-resourced communities participate in planning, creating, producing, and critiquing products and performances.
Within community sites dedicated to involving young people in sustained science learning, Dr. Heath has given special attention to the ways in which science learning demands a close analysis of visual detail, trial and error, sketching and modeling projects, and strategic problem solving. In her research on families, friendship groups, and community organizations, she studies how responsible roles accelerate desires for organizational, scientific, and mathematical knowledge.
In the course of pursuing her research, Dr. Heath has authored a stunning array of acclaimed volumes and articles. She is the author of Words at Work and Play, 3 Decades in Families and Communities, and the classic Ways with Words, Language, Life, and Work in Communities and Classrooms. Ways with Words, a multi-site longitudinal study of children learning to use language at home and at school in 2 communities only a few miles apart in the southeastern United States, has fundamentally reshaped conversations on language and literacy development and the transition from communal setting to school, classroom, and beyond.
Also of particular note are Dr. Heath's publications written for community advocates of creating environments which the arts and sciences are both viewed as essential to building highly effective learning environments. In 2004, with Shelby Wolf, she published a series on, quote, visual learning for teachers and art practitioners. In 2005, she published a similar series on learning through drama and in arts and science project-based work. In several nations, she has studied youth-based community organizations in which the young devote themselves to environmental projects, social justice, enterprise development, and educational inclusion. Her resource guide and prize-winning documentary, Art Show, published in 2000, features young leaders in 4 interracial and cross-class community arts organizations in the United States. She has also directed and produced 2 short documentaries on youth organizations dedicated to the sustainable agriculture and environmental architecture.
Dr. Heath has taught at universities throughout the world, most notably Standford University and Brown University, and is visiting research professor at King's College, University of London. Dr. Heath has and continues to make an indelible mark on the way in which we understand, as she states, the study of values and behaviors into which oral and written language and other symbol systems are embedded. In doing so, asking us to carefully consider our methodological approach, outcomes, and possibilities for further application.
In today's talk titled The World Without Writing and Reading Extended Text, really? So what? Dr. Heath ponders, are young adults of today truly going to live in a world without extended text in their daily patterns of learning and working? As she examines the spectrum of changes within writing throughout the 21st century. We are so grateful for her body of work and for her presence with us today. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Shirley Brice Heath.
Wow, I haven't had an intro like that in quite a while. I do want to ask, though, that there are 2 seats here. I think there may be 1 seat there that has something on it or whatever, but at least there are 2 here. And we're happy to move them so that you don't have to feel that you're on observation, and there's a chair here. So please do come so I don't feel that you're uncomfortable throughout. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly glad to have been introduced by graduate students. One of the issues that I always face, as you probably now realize having heard that introduction, is that I never know who it is that people expect to come here. Which part of me? Are they coming to hear me talk about science? Or are they coming to hear me talk about art or whatever? And it's the problem of never knowing what you're going to be when you grow up, and I'm still trying to figure it out. Though I keep getting in trouble saying that in other countries. I was recently in the Middle East and said that, and they were all quite puzzled as to whether I could possibly mean that. And I said, yes, I do. It's young at heart. And then they didn't know what that meant, so I had to explain that. But it is great to be back here. I think I was here probably 20 years ago in the English department, and so I haven't been on this part of the campus at all. And as you probably noted, and some of you may know me in this capacity, I tend to be rather sassy about the ways in which people come to simplistic conclusions. And as you know, everybody's been declaring libraries dead and reading dead and writing dead for a number of years. And the issue is that when you look closely, the answers are much more complex than we might expect. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to address that question through, I decided I was going to write on very small pieces of paper exactly how I was going to address it. Because I thought about this in the middle of the night, and I thought, well, how can I say, because there are 3 very different stories. The first story I want to tell is one that says that early childhood destiny does not spell the end, and the end of reading and writing or being successful in further life. And I say that because there have been so many publications recently that have compared middle and upper class families and their language input for children with those of lower income, and they've come out saying, in essence, to many people, that those who do not have lots of language input early are somehow doomed, and also those who don't have bedtime stories, and I want to counter that a bit and tell you why. And the second little point, to wit the small pieces of paper, I want to talk about 2 or 3 social interventions, and they are definitely social interventions, that can make a whale of a difference in terms of very surprising change. And that involves me in telling you a little bit about some design experiments that I've been privileged to do in various parts of the world in the last 4 or 5 years. And the final thing I want to say is no surprise to those of you who've read Words at Work and Play, and that is the point that we've never understood the nature of play for us as humans. We certainly understand it in terms of studying primates. And for years I taught primatology, and we spent most of our time studying play and the effect on chimps. There are 2 chairs here, so please, please, I'll feel so much better if somebody's sitting there, because I'm definitely not going to sit. So in any event, that I want to talk about the importance of play, and I want to talk also about the importance of projects, that is, taking on things that involve planning and involve lots and lots of work. So let me begin with the first story, and the first story relates how I wrote the chapter for a book called The Handbook of Research on Children's and Young Adult Literature, and some of you may know that, particularly if you have worked with Gay and Maisha, both of whom do very similar work to my own in that they study the life course learning and they study learning outside of schools, namely in libraries and bookstores, etc. So this was a book that was put out several years ago called The Handbook of Research on Children's and Young Adult Literature. And the editors asked me to write a chapter, and they gave me a title, which I thought was a bit arrogant, but they did. And the title was The Book as Home. And so I wrote a chapter, and some of you know me as a social historian, and I wrote a chapter in which I documented in the Western world the rise of furniture in association with making books have a home in homes across the Western world, and how that contrasted with other parts of the world. And then I talked about the development of books, et cetera, and the role of the hand in making books then and now. Well, they wrote back a very polite refusal of the chapter. And so I wrote back and said, I'd just like a very short response as to why you refused the chapter. And they said, well, because we want something personal. And I said, I don't do personal. And that's simple. And they said, well, we're going to send you some chapters to read and see if you can perhaps follow the model, which was a very bad mistake. Because after I read the chapters, I knew exactly what the editors wanted from me. And some of these editors were old good friends. And they wanted me to write a very quiet, soothing piece about how much I had as a child found solace in reading books, and how I had been read to, and how books had made me a scholar who could read and write. And it might be handy if I would even point out how teachers had helped me along the way to do that reading along with my parents. But the trouble was that my attitude, as some of you know, is that I wasn't going to play their game because I didn't belong to their team. So the biographical portrayals of the chapters they sent me did not fit me at all. Moreover, I was extremely uneasy with the implications of the chapters they had sent me, which were that the whole world was alike and everybody grew up reading, and as they read, they all did the same thing with their reading. And so as an anthropologist who'd worked in communities all around the world, I knew that it was all a big lie for most of the children of the world. And it certainly was a lie for me. And so I knew that children learned to talk in several languages, and they learned to talk often without face-to-face contact, which is still very puzzling to linguists, that many of these people who had learned to talk early in life had never seen a book, and yet they learned to read later in life, and that these children, as they grew up into adults, certainly didn't lack energy, imagination, and capacity. So then I decided that I would write, but I did so in anger. And that's never a good idea, but in this case, I look back at that chapter and I think it's probably some of the best writing I've ever done in my life, because I remember exactly where I was sitting, and I sat and I wrote because I was furious. I was furious not only because it was such an insult to me and my background, but it was an insult to most of the children of the world. So in that chapter, I told my own story for the very first time. I didn't grow up with books. I didn't grow up surrounded by them. I didn't grow up with anyone who could read. I grew up with my granny, who didn't read. She was a great pretender. She would hold the Old Testament, and she knew the Old Testament came at the front of the Bible, and she could hold it, and she knew the stories. And so she knew J-O-B, that was very easy, the book of Job and the book of Daniel, and she could find those, and she would go and open it and tell the stories. And they were very good stories, and why wouldn't those stories capture the imagination of kids? And so that's how I grew up, and then later I was with foster parents, and they didn't read either. But they did have, in a room that was never heated in the wintertime, shelves and shelves of books. But we were not, I had an older foster brother, 1 year older than I. We weren't allowed to go there. So I went to a school there, and again, there were no books. And then I went back to the place where my grandmother lived, where there was a 3-room school, and there were no books in that school, except behind the principal's desk, and those were kept for very special students. So in essence, I grew up without books. I kept getting sent books, and I tell the story in the chapter by various people, and I didn't know what, I was quite puzzled by them. I didn't know what you did with them, and my grandmother did not believe that you sat around and read. And in fact, one of the things that I had done in that chapter that I wrote that was rejected was I had talked about the portrayal of reading in arts. And this is a portrayal of a woman who has her back to the world, a young woman who's reading, and how so many of the pieces of art really show how reading is what lazy women do, or women like this who read to escape from everything. This is a young homeless woman on the street reading, and also how women find themselves cornered and secluded from the world when they read. So I knew all that as background to what I was writing about. So as I told the story, I made the point that what really mattered, as is often the case, was the amount of language, direct language input that I had, where there were lots and lots of stories. I lived in an all-black area and grew up in the tobacco fields with families where there were lots of stories. So as we worked in the tobacco fields, there were stories. And there were stories constantly. That's what you do when you work. You tell stories. You tell about what you're doing. You tell about what happened, the size of the tobacco worms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they decided to accept that chapter. And if you're interested, you could look it up and read the full thing, because I did manage to get a lot of history in it. Surreptitiously, not my history, but the history of art, etc. But the issue is that I later on did learn to know books, but not really until I had children. And then I discovered that everybody I knew kept talking about reading to their children, all these colleagues, and what are you reading to your children? You're not telling stories? Because I was still telling stories to my kids. And no, we're reading books. So I started reading books, and I found children's books on the whole rather uninteresting in their language. I only found the pictures interesting. So we talk about the pictures and extract from the pictures. So what I really wanted to do in that chapter was to talk about the value of language input, and also the value of looking at ideas and thinking about ideas, and drawing and reading and modeling and building. And that was, of course, because of my own background and growing up very much working with my hands, and literally working with my hands. The other issue that I wanted to point out in that chapter, and I do, came from the version of the first chapter that they'd rejected, was how important through the ages it's been for people to be able to have sufficient light to read and sufficient place to store books. When I was working in Papua New Guinea, one of the biggest problems we had in providing books to people who were learning to read their own languages in Papua New Guinea was because as soon as we produced a book, the next week it would be eaten by one of a variety of critters. some of them quite small. So if I had not fully understood by having silverfish and mice in our context, I certainly understood there that in most parts of the world, just having a paper book, there's a reason that early books were made of materials that could withstand insects better than ours can. The other thing that I wanted very much to point out in that chapter was, and I make a point of this at the end, was the fact that the more we know about reading from various interdisciplinary perspectives, the more we understand that reading is, in a sense, very much an end product. It is not the initiating product. And when I say it is the end product, I'm talking primarily about the fact that what we really want reading to do is to enable people to learn. And that learning is best built on a system of ways of knowing the self. I'm reading it in order to learn. And I intimate at the end of that chapter the fact that I was at that point really very much realizing that, because for the last 10, 15 years I've been very much immersed in the neurosciences. Which happily my introducers did not try to explain, because I think I'm still at the kindergarten level. But talk about learning to read all over again. I'm not trained in the neurosciences. I took 2 years out to work with medical school to try to learn as much as I possibly could, but still reading in that field or in any new field is a matter of wanting to learn, to know, to do, to be something. So the know, the do, the be is what really matters, and it means that you put something into it. So the second story I want to tell, following on my own story, some of you who've read Words at Work and Play will know, is what happened when I followed the 300 families that I'd written about up until the early 80s from the Southeast, is that those families over the years, particularly starting by the mid-1990s, began to reveal some characteristics that many of us have now let slip into our own families, because that has been very characteristic of modern economies since the mid-1990s. And that is that there was a very, very, very sharp decline in number one, times of dedicated play. Play was very much supervised by an adult. It was not free play, and it was certainly not play in nature, not play in going out and exploring outside, exploring insects and exploring the world. When you think about going out to play in nature, one of the first things you have to think about is what children do when they go to play in nature. And that is, they want to touch things. They want to explore with their hands. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And they're exploring with their hands and their eyes. Their eyes lead them to use their hands, which is very fundamentally a primate trait. Eyes lead you to explore with your hands. And this is why we first learned that chimps can do tools when we saw them break off a stick, stick it down into the ant pile to pull the ants out and be able to eat the ants like a lollipop. So the issue here is that play in nature, if that is pulled away from children, then and so is the opportunity to play with natural objects, there is not the use of the hand and the forearm. And the hand and the forearm really matter. They matter very much in terms of how we actually learn. So the other thing that I learned in following these families 30 years on was that young people, particularly after the age of 8, were spending relatively little time in homes with families. They were spending time with intimate strangers, they were spending time with their friends, and they were spending time with technologies, and therefore using digits. And that meant that models of dress, models of talk, models of music, models of everything came at them through the mediation of technology, rather than in mediation and discussion with individuals, and certainly not through making anything. I remember the great shock I experienced the first Halloween when I realized that parents didn't make their children's Halloween costumes. I could not imagine not making a costume. They were all bought, and I went to a home and home after home after home and saw racks that were kept from year after year of bought Halloween costumes. That was a horrifying thing to me. And you can't imagine just how horrifying it was because it meant so much. The other thing that really mattered were peers, but the peers were mediated in some distant form from the technology presentations of entertainment. So I want to be Spider-Man, I want to be Batman, I want to be, you know, whatever, but it's because that's what Johnny's going to be, or it's what, you know, I want to be Batman because he's going to be Spider-Man, or whatever the particular form of entertainment was. The other thing I learned in studying the 30 years on was that whenever I was looking at the young people after 2000, particularly between 2004 and 2012, one of the things that I found was that it was not that they were not learning. They were doing a lot of learning, but that voluntary learning tended to be taking place where they could engage in some kind of intent participation, as Barbara Rogoff calls it, where they were engaging in close observation of other people doing something in which they had an interest, and they watched them ask questions not only about what they were doing, about how can I learn more about this, how can I come to do this, how can I do this? And whether that was playing baseball or whether it was playing ice hockey or whether it was learning to collect insects, whether it was learning to pin the wings of butterflies, whatever it was, that was, again, mediated by at the first level, by other novices for the most part. However, what I found when I followed this was that they were also finding experts. And so that's when I latched on to something that has become sort of a mantra for me. I almost said non-mantra, but a mantra, a full mantra. And that is the importance of studying how people learn on their own time and in their own way. And you might say that, well, Shirley, why was that a discovery for you? That's what you've been doing all your life. You haven't really been somebody who spent a whole lot of time just in classrooms or just in formal instruction. And that's true because most of us know that 97% of the learning we do in life is on our own time and in our own way. And I don't mean that it doesn't involve formal instruction, because if I decide that I really want to know more about breast cancer, then I may well go and take classes, or I may well go to seminars, I may go to experts, I will go and read the documents that I can trust, and then I'll check whether I can trust those documents with other people. If I have a child who is diagnosed with autism or a particular kind of child cancer, I will also do the same thing. Now those are extreme cases. That's learning on your own time in your own way through crisis, which is often what happens. But the other way is the way I mentioned earlier, which is I develop an interest. I meet you, you tell me about a particular kind of music that comes out of Indonesia with a particular instrument, and then I say, I want to know more about that instrument. I can't imagine an instrument that is doing that kind of 12 beat thing. And that doesn't make any sense to me. And you're telling me Middle Eastern drumming is not like African drumming? How is it different? How can I learn about it? And, you know, I go and I listen, and then I go find experts, and I do all sorts of things. So I learned to zero in on what we're actually doing. And then finally, the thing that I think is probably the most shocking and would tell you, if you believed the stories that I mentioned at the outset of the research fully, that if you don't have a lot of language input when you're young, then you're sort of doomed not to be able to succeed academically. What I found between 2010 and 2012 is that young people between the ages of 12 and 18 spent about 7 minutes each week engaged in extended talk on the same topic with adults. Now, we're guessing that children between the ages of 18 months and 24 months need 20,000 words a day. So you can imagine what that means. Now, 7 minutes on the same topic with the same adult is very dialogic, it is very focused, and it is backing back and forth, moving, jumping ahead, testing, pushing ideas. And I have hundreds of thousands of hours of that kind of conversation, but it was not happening in those years. And there were lots of reasons why. Now people say, well, what about kids on sports teams? Well, they get a lecture by the coach at the end of the game. They watch the game and they get a few words of analysis as they watch the game being videoed by a diligent parent. They watch games on television. They may talk about the games with other peers, but they tend not to have as many as 7 minutes of engaged time. Very, very rarely was this the case. And there was one exception. And the one exception was when adults, often in the family, obviously, shared the same passion or the shared sense of interest as the parent, or as the aunt, or as Cousin Charlie. And I might not approve of Cousin Charlie because he spends a lot of his time in jazz clubs and I'm not so sure what he does there. But if my kid wants to go there and they'll let my kid in and I can trust my kid not to drink, I want my kid with Charlie because they're going to be talking about jazz. He's going to know who Charlie Parker was. He's going to know who is doing the best re-recordings of the concerts of Charlie Parker. He's going to know who Charlie Parker worked with. He's going to know all that stuff. And he, too, can talk for more than 7 minutes on the topic of jazz or Charlie Parker or who it is Charlie Parker works with. Because the thing that I finally, I mean, this is going to sound like I was an idiot, but I finally realized that when a young person gets a passion of interest, they may say, oh, I'm really interested in jazz. But when you begin to pull it apart, it takes all of these tangents. And so it moves in 50 to 100 different directions. So it's not just Charlie Parker. It's who's doing the best resurrections of the concerts of Charlie Parker that have never been really well done. Have they been well resurrected? Who's the best imitator of Charlie Parker? So the issue here, and many people hear me wrong on this, is not that there is something wrong or that I think we're going to be able to change the effects of technology. We're not going to be able to change the fact that 71% of mothers today work outside with children, work outside the home, and therefore do not have the time to spend those 7 minutes of extended talk. They're not preparing meals. They're not doing extended work at home. They're not sewing their own clothes. They're not cleaning their own houses. They're not repairing their own back steps, and neither are fathers. And that what happens is that when 71% of mothers with children work outside the home, and you realize 40% of mothers, of those mothers, are single parents. Once again, we all understand that issue. So we've got to think that, not that that's wrong. We can't change what's happened in terms of the economy. We also can't change the fact that those mothers are earning about 2/3, occasionally when they're lucky, 3/4 of what the men are earning, and that once they have children, their wages are going to drop. Men, when they have children, their wages go up. So those are facts. We can't alter those. We can work to alter them, but we're not going to be able to rise up tomorrow and change those. So you've got to hear me say we have to live with those circumstances and find ways, niches, pushes to do it. So this brings me then across the whole idea of where I went back to basics. And I went back to the basics of the hand and the power of the hand. Because in my neurological work, one of the things that I had really learned a lot about was this whole issue of when and why and how the hand makes a difference. And you may have seen the recent article in the New York Times on handwriting and how with the loss of cursive writing, lots and lots of people, ranging from psychologists to neurologists, are finding that their diminished skills in ability to read, which is the first thing people go to, which always amuses me because it's like taking the thing at the end of the tunnel. As it's not the ability to read, it's all the other stuff that has to come before it, which is the recognition of language capacities, which are multilingual in so many cases now in classrooms and in communities, and also the recognition of what it is that individuals do with the hand. So once I got into it, I decided that I was going to test it and find a way to do that within some reasonable amount of time. So I went to the heads of the major teaching hospitals in the US, and I went to the surgery departments and talked to the head of the surgery teaching unit, and I asked two questions. What are the major differences you see in the young people coming in to study surgery today that you didn't see 10 years ago or 15, however old they were? I had to be careful about that. And what do you think might have caused it or might be done about it? What? Well, uniformly, and you always get very suspicious of this kind of data, they said two things. One, they can't use their hands. They have no idea how to use their hands. And they can't see. So think about this the next time you go into surgery. And I said that to all of them. I said, you know, as more and more and more, you know, I was up to about 22, and I thought, ooh, yeah, I'm not having anybody I know and love have surgery. In fact, let's put this in the paper. So then I thought, well, maybe this is just a US thing. So then I was working in, some of you know that I work in Europe a good bit of the time and have since 1999. And I went to a number of people in England, and particularly the head of the teaching unit for surgery at Imperial College of Medicine, who happened to be married to a potter, sculptor we would tend to call them in this country, a craftsperson they call them in England. And his name is Roger Kneebone, so it's a very distinctive name. And if you want to know more about him, just you won't forget that name, I can be sure. Go to TED Med, and he has a wonderful demonstration lecture on this issue. And he was absolutely passionate about this thing. And he said, of course. He looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, you were surprised? And I said, well, I'm not a surgeon. You know, I'm a linguist, and I'm interested in how people learn. And I am interested in how that has changed, and I gave him a bit of my research, and he was fascinated, and he said, well, it sounds like your young people are very much like our young people. They're coming in, and I find that they don't listen. They can't remember more than about 2 to 3% of what they hear in extended text. I now think about that a lot when I give lectures like this. You'll go out of here remembering 2% of what I said. And probably 1% of that will not be quite right. But in any event, we used to be able to say 7%, right? But in any event, he said the other thing is that I have a terrible time teaching them to use their hands. So what we're doing now is we're working very carefully with the Crafts Council and the Arts Council of England. So 2 weeks ago, when unfortunately I could not be there because I was working with a museum in Denmark with refugees who were coming in from Syria, and which a little bit more about that, just a tiny bit, because we don't have all afternoon. But the issue was that at that conference held 2 weeks ago on the 17th of September, what they did was bring medical people and surgeons together with folks in robotics and teachers, and particularly teachers in the arts. And England has more arts teaching than we do in this country, still surviving in the schools. And I just want to share with you just some points that were made at that conference. One of them was the question from a teacher, is there any relationship between language and the use of the hand? And the person who was there, who was a neuropsychologist, said, yes, there certainly is. And one of the things that we know is that the structures of the brain that are concerned with language and the structures that control the hand are immediately adjacent to one another. So what happens when the hand is, I can't believe I'm up here without something to grip. I can grip this, but when not as an instrument, thank you, that's what I needed. But when the hand grips, and particularly as the child moves from doing this or doing this, we've all had the child in the crib who, you know, takes the diaper off and then decides to wipe the fecal matter on the wall, and they're doing it this way, and then gradually they might be doing it this way, but the issue is that we want them to learn not to do that, to do with other things, and they may grip it this way, and then as they learn to do this, which is a very, very difficult task to learn, that we know that there is a force field effect that is immediate in the brain. And that is essentially getting activation in the language areas. Well, what we didn't know was the extent to which it was activating. Why is this? What did? No, I don't. Well, it's nannying me. Go away. Go away. Thank you. Go away. I don't want to do that. There we go. Okay. Yeah, I know it's extremely nannying. If you can just, yeah, there we go. Thanks. So in any event, that whole day was spent on points like that with teachers, and getting the teachers and the surgeons and the medical people in various fields to come to understand something about the importance of these ways of reconciling our understanding. Now, one of the other issues that I will always go back to is the issue of primate, and being a primate is that the hand is very much a way of extending ourselves and getting other people to know us, and also getting us to know others. And we know that children who learn gestural language learn that language faster than they learn to speak. One of the other things that we know is, okay, why are you not doing this? Okay, Maisha, it's totally frozen. It won't do anything. One of the things that we do definitely know is that when this visualization is very much enhanced, as it is with the use of the hand, then there is a slowdown, and that slowdown comes in particular when individuals are able, whether it's Chinese children learning to hold chopsticks, or whether it's learning to hold a paintbrush, or whether it's learning to hold a fork and a knife. And think about the coordination of the way in which some cultures use knives and forks, and the way the British eat off the back of the fork, and all of that sort of coordination. And watching the Syrian children a few weeks ago and realizing, and the children coming in from Eritrea, these were all orphans who had never seen a knife or fork, and certainly had never seen a napkin. And that was the most puzzling thing, because they didn't know whether to eat it or what to do with it. And looking around at the few other children, all of whom were also orphan asylum-seeking children, that I realized just how complex those understandings are. And then to start to teach a 9-year-old how to hold an implement that they're going to be able to cling and use instrumentally for the first time was pretty striking. So these are just some shots of various sites in which I've been able to study what happens when young people come in. We do very strong test of their language abilities, oral, performative in various ways. Tell me the lyrics of 6 songs that you know, and how would you compare them, and tell me a bit about the singers, and we play them and let them listen to them. We're not reading test anything like school. And then watch them as they begin to do this kind of work. And also as they do collaborative work, which is something I'll come back to in a minute, or using their hands for highly technical work. And then a few years ago, I got very interested in moving on from the medical work to the idea that many people, particularly surgeons, are musicians. And I wondered if there was a correlation. So this is a brain. I won't go in, these are several brains, as a matter of fact. I won't go into it, but what you see at the top is a comparison. This just was done a few weeks ago by Nadine Gabb, who is a neurologist at Harvard, And what you see is the difference between, at the top, the activation of the brain by experienced musicians in particular tasks having to do with verbalization, visualization, and these are the adult brains, those who are not trained in music. And this was a very, very, very carefully done study. And now, for me, because I have access to El Sistema USA, which are orchestras that are starting all over the world, but we have a few in the United States that are successful, called El Sistema USA, and these are orchestras that start in ensemble music and sometimes choral music with children who are 6 and 7 and 8, and where we have one program now that's going to do younger. And so I was interested in the difference in the brains of children who had begun music. And these are children who have had at least 2 years of music. And you can again see the difference. You're getting the development of these sections of the brain that we know are connected to what people typically call executive function. And the issue goes back to exactly what you will recognize, which is the holding of a bow, the holding of a cello, the holding of percussion sticks for drumming, et cetera, et cetera. So there is so much focus. And executive function, which typically gets thrown around without being explained, these refer, of course, to cognitive capacities that we think of as being behind planned and controlled behavior, self-monitoring, some people talk about it as. And it's a very strongly, this is Nadine, and I wanted to give you the reference, and this is in one of the few online trusted journals in medicine. But one of the issues here is, as you can see, the need to hold, and you're having to hold and coordinate with both hands. Obviously, I don't have to explain to you what happens there, and this is a picture from the LA group. Now, why does this matter so much? It matters for those of us who care about academic abilities, because we know that in the modern economies, those are going to matter. And what we can see is that activation of those sections of the brain that are involved in executive function turns out to be more highly and significantly correlated with academic behaviors or readiness, if you will, than measures of intelligence. And most of us probably suspect those measures of intelligence anyway, but also to predict these skills. And you might say, well, wait a minute, Shirley, you've been disparaging reading as an end product. Now you're putting it up there. Why are you putting it up there? Well, because what happens is that if you go to look at the insides of the NAEP studies of reading, one of the things that you'll find is those who scored the best will tell you that one of the things they remember that they were doing a lot was interpreting what they were reading. And that interpreting is using executive function. That is, taking what you're getting put in, what you're hearing, what you're reading, and then playing with the ideas. And also that you have the cognitive flexibility to take on questions like, what do you think would have happened had that particular winter not been a winter of such severity? Can you imagine rewriting the story in that way? Or in science, any of the nonfiction writing, the ways in which you would predict. And Gay and I had a long conversation this morning about something that we're both passionate about, and probably try not to talk with other people about very much because they're not as passionate as we are, which is YA novels. And because one of the things that YA novels do is require a great deal of interpretation, which is why kids who read YA novels spend so much of their time talking about them. Because, did you see that the same way? And then reinserting this knowledge into themselves. Now, much of my work is with older kids, but the executive function work is very important for young children, which is one of the reasons working with LA Phil, we now have 4 youth orchestras. One of them with very young is, that's when the cognitive flexibility and the development of working memory, that is storing these things you're going to use later, really get started, and the planning But we know that these are so important, particularly going on to adolescence and into young adulthood. There's a reason why the car insurance costs are so great for young adults, and why they also can't rent cars. But these are things that really matter, and it's one of the things that happens. If you want to test yourself or test what I've said sometime, take a camera, go into a situation where young people are working with clay or working with painting, and one of the things you'll find is that you will never be able to see them handling an instrument, handling a tool, that they are not focused visually. That focus visually is coordinate with the hand movement, which again, I mean, the surgeon in England said, why wouldn't you have figured that out? And I said, well, I'm not a surgeon, but I'm glad you figured it out. You can tell me. And this is one of the refugee children that Shelby Wolf and I worked with in England. And this is one of my favorite pictures because this was some months after the child had come into the country from Sierra Leone at that time. In early adolescence, again, one of the things we're finding and why it's so important to immerse them in this learn on your own time in your own way is to really have this working memory stretched so that you go to the museum and you spend time. I mean, if you haven't been to your own museum, I was dropped off by the bus there yesterday and spent time in that museum in the sculpture area, and it's really quite incredible. And just having young children go through and see where they see the sculpture. I mean, the sculpture's in all sorts of different places, and what happens with sculpture is often that it exaggerates things. And what is that exaggeration of? And, you know, think about a wise David. You know, the statue of David, so much bigger than any David ever was. There are lots of reasons to that. But the issue is that the working memory is really important for adolescents to be able to use, and the processing speed. Processing speed to linguists really means just being able to see something and quickly recognize it and make associations. So it is this constant comparative, which interestingly enough we talk about primarily in art classes and science classes, but it comes up all the time in these other areas. Rule representation is a term I certainly didn't know in this context, and it is this ability to be able to switch tasks quickly, but also know the rules for why you're switching task. So in surgery, you can imagine that's very, very important because you're monitoring all of these things around you. You're monitoring heart, you're monitoring blood flow, blood pressure, et cetera, and you have to read simultaneously, but you're going to have to switch if you see any of those drop precipitously. And this is one of the things that we've been doing in England, is experimenting in the lobby of a foundation, having demonstrations of surgeons with ballet dancers. And we always link the arts and the sciences, and the ballet dancers are demonstrating in exaggerated ways what's actually happening as the surgeons do the shifting, and bringing young people in and then talking with the surgeons and the ballet dancers in terms of how they studied the surgeons, and the surgeons in terms of how they studied the ballet dancers. But this is so important through adolescence. This does not mean multitasking. That is not the same as rule representation. It is simultaneity of focus with an internalized sense of the rules you have to follow when you switch the task, so that you are in control of all of them, and that's hard. It's hard. And then these prefrontal areas, which are so important, really matter. This we know then, which was a huge shock to me, will bring fairly rapid changes to the brain. And it's changes that are taking place now in primarily, we thought first it was 3 areas, and now I think we're up to the point where we're saying in at least 6 areas. And one of the reasons is that we have if you want to think about the 300 billion cells, about 2/3 of those we think of as being dedicated to locomotor. You think about what it takes for you to talk. The rest is what we think of as cognitive, including part of linguistic in terms of talking to ourselves. So when you think about it, why doesn't it make sense that embodiment, that is moving as you learn, using your hands, seeing it, molding it, touching it, making it, would enable the cognitive to develop? Because you've got a 2/3 punch working on that cognitive as long as you have the various sorts of input toward creativity through a planned, pre-envisioned activity. And therein lies the rub. It has to be planned, it has to be sustained, and that's what really matters. So these are the things that matter all along the way. So these 5 and 7-year-olds, the verbal interaction is full of metaphors. The conductor talking to these ensembles use music words that I don't understand. And I've just written a chapter on all the various ways in which certain metaphors do not have any visual representation, and the kids have to interpret that, nor do they have a manual representation for the kids. And then finally, I want to just hit on the point about going back to the issue of rule representation. Why is it that the reading and writing, going back to my original question, it's not the reading and writing, it's all the other stuff that makes that have to come inevitably. When people come to see themselves having a future, Gay and I talked about this so much this morning with kids who read YA. They come to see themselves as having some kind of future moving out from their interpretation of the books, even as dismal as some of the books are to adults. Kids will see themselves moving out from those. But the collaborative nature of it then reinforces. We just finished a big study at Standford on what happens when people think they're collaborating as opposed to when they think they're working alone. And when they think they're collaborating, even though they can't see their collaborator. This is all done with, avatars and robots and so forth. And then, telling them lies about real people. But the issue, this is experimental stuff. But the issue is the motivation increases when I think I have a role in relationship to you. My role matters because you matter to me. And if I don't, you're going to socially engage with me. Which is why, we went to social-cognitive learning. Of course, it matters. And there's no way in which that happens more than in a surgical team, obviously. Never mind the patient's out of the question, but it's the surgical team. But it also matters in ensemble orchestral work or chorus work. I mean, you've watched choruses where, I grew up in the South and spent much of my time in black churches where you don't want to put a white person in there because most white people who haven't grown up that way don't know how to move with it. So the body is moving this way and but that's very hard when you're trying to interpret the music and you're thinking about your alto, et cetera, et cetera. So in any kind of work, the coordination and collaboration matter. And all of these ways, this is just from the study that came out a couple weeks ago, and the persistence matters. So this is why collaboration matters, and these are some of the studies that those who introduced me mentioned, which are in primary schools and community connections across all sorts of folks, including some of the most resistant groups who would be these refugees coming in from all over the world. We have now, as we have recently sort of done that and moved on in this country, the whole idea of child migrants. But there is all over the world this huge movement of child migrants. And we aren't thinking about what to do with them, except send them back. But we can't send them back to Syria. We can't send them back to Eritrea. We can't send them back to the Congo. When I was in Denmark, we were trying to get them out. The Red Cross is doing this and bringing them out. But what are we going to do? I mean, the estimation is, beyond our imagination in terms of numbers. And those are children who haven't had schooling of any kind. And the places that have stepped up are theaters and museums. And what they're doing is all the kinds of things we've talked about. Now, were they informed by neuroscience? No. They know this intuitively, as every art teacher does. And we're putting them in a situation where all of this is able to happen. And maybe at some other time when I'm here, I'll tell you about a second-year experiment in which I really did a design experiment where we had cross-age, formerly incarcerated 20 to 25 years, foster children, domestic workers, immigrants, domestic worker unions, nannies, and domestic workers, and elders, and young people from the South Bronx. This is all 5 boroughs in New York. And that's been, we just finished the second year data analysis on that in terms of what actually happens, because they were all brought together, 200 people together in New York to produce a huge show of Shakespeare in the largest venue in New York City. And that had all of these characteristics, plus high risk, high visibility, and very dangerous roles, because everybody would have said they failed if they failed. And they were working with 4 equity actors in a major public theater in New York. But it was definitely very much an experiment. We're going into the 3rd year next year, and we'll see how much those habits sustain themselves and how they pass them on. But what we found was that they were all doing much more reading. They were taking classes. It's the same thing that I found back with the art show data back in 2000. If they got involved in the arts, in theater, in visual arts, what they did, once they had sustained participation and strong performances and strong critiques, what they did, they went to take more classes. Many of these people are now holding jobs that they've never been able to hold a job before, and they are re-entering, and in some cases for the young people, they're going into school. So these are all the sorts of things that happened to them in the case of the refugee work and also the work in New York City. But then finally, I just wanted to share this with you because it has come to mean something for me, because the work in New York I really could not quite figure out, because I was very, very skeptical, because these were the most resistant learners. These were people who had been in prison for 20 to 25 years and were living in, scattered across the city, but often in a communal area, had never had successful school experiments, and they were with foster kids, some of whom were still living on the streets when they were working with us, and elders who said, oh, I can't walk, I can't leave my walker at home, I can't leave my cane at home, etc. I thought, oh, we're never going to be able to pull this off. I mean, I wrote the plan, but then I thought I'd written it for, dooming us all. But I then went back to something I remembered when I was in my philosophy class at college. So this will encourage you to go back to, I don't want you to read Kant. That would be a condemnation of a terrible sort, perhaps. But I remembered reading in his critique of judgment about aesthetics. And I had no interest in the arts in that time. I was a social scientist, I was an anthropologist, a linguist, etc. But I went back recently and read it, and this statement says for me, in this amazing way that philosophers going back to Plato and Aristotle and before could say. And he talks in the Critique of Judgment about this thing called spirit. And again, Gay and I said something about this morning in terms of teachers. In an aesthetical sense, this is the name, that is the name of spirit, given to the animating principle of the mind. But that whereby this principle animates the soul, the material which it applies to that purpose, is that which puts the mental powers purposefully into swing. That is, into such a play as maintains itself and strengthens the mental powers in their exercise. Why did I have to do my research? I should have gone back and read Kant. That says it all. Thank you so much. I'm happy to do whatever, take questions.
We have a half an hour, generous amount of time for questions, so please ask away.
Comment away, ask away, whatever. This is, by the way, in Kant's section in Critique of Judgment on genius. And he's talking about genius coming up in unexpected ways, in unexpected places. And certainly that's what has happened for us in, all the work we've done. I mean, extraordinary. If you don't ask questions, I'll keep talking. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. I was reminded as we're going through the discussion about the hand, about Mike Rose's book on the mind at work.
Yes.
And how he looks at the very careful.
Right. Especially the first chapter, the one with his mother, yes.
Right.
And also the one on motorcycles. Not that Mike did, but I'm blanking on the name of the guy who did it. Soul of the Machine. And it's on the power of working with motorcycles. And we certainly have seen this in California with kids who do low-rider bikes. The aesthetic power that goes into that, plus the fact if you've ever decorated a bicycle or a car as a low-rider car, that's very difficult to do. And we recently in California had an exhibition of these cars that are done so that they look like they have fire coming out of the engine and so forth. That is not an easy technical process or artistic process. And when you get young people involved in this, it's extraordinary because they're learning to fix the bikes, they're learning how to deal with the dents, they're learning about different composition, how do you mix the old Raleighs and et cetera. I mean, it's all science and art. And that's what, there's no way to take science and art apart. It has to hang together. It's all
Shirley, I was going to ask you something about that. So I was, but Mike makes a really interesting point about the class-based notion about manual labor, like working with hands associated with working class, manual labor, blue-collar type work, and he makes a really profound argument throughout the book about that. Absolutely. And I was wondering if in your thinking about this, in talking with folks about it, if that, how have you dealt with that? Has it come across? Do you think about it in that way? I think in general we do tend to think about working with hands as a class, as a manual labor type issue. So, I was just curious if you, what
one of it is a big issue. It's a bigger issue in this country than it is in England, where they really still have a respect for the craft movement, and also in Europe, and where there is a true regeneration of work with hand and handmade things. The only way I've been able to find to cut across it is, and it relates very much to the notion of play, because what I find, and this is maybe horrifying to you, but if you think about it, don't reject it out of hand. Middle and upper class mothers find it too much of a workmanship-like task to play with their children. So when we did a big thing in Central Park in New York City a couple of years ago, the NSF center that I work with on neuroscience and informal learning, they call it informal learning. I don't call it volunteer learning. But in any event, we were flooded with middle and upper class parents saying, I don't know how to play with my children. I send them to Jamboree, or I bring somebody in to play with them. And the somebody they bring in inevitably often did not speak the same language and did not come from a culture where they would talk directly to the child, and certainly if they didn't speak the kid's language. And so what they were finding was they were slowing down on language development, and they thought, well, I should probably play with my children. But when we did all their demonstrations about what was important, they said, I don't see myself doing that. So it is this ability to play, get on the floor and play with clay and dirt and leaves and mold and get in the sandbox and go on nature walks and not, not be phobic about ticks. You got to be careful about ticks. I'm right up on that one. But we find it's very much the same thing. And as that happens, as that attitude is there, it gets pushed down into the lower classes. And we certainly found in the regenerating communities in England where no one had been seen employed aside from lorry drivers, truck drivers, bus drivers, and teachers and nurses at the school for 3 generations. Their attitude was, why do I have to play with my children? They just watch the telly all day. And that is an impossible thing to work around. Where I find the possibilities are with young people living in totally unresourced communities. And nobody's very interested in those kids at all. And when I took the plunge in New York to mix these ages, my insistence with the public theater was that it had to be cross-age, it had to have all 5 boroughs, it had to have some class mixture. But again, we had to use young people. We couldn't get any big dance with 200 community people and put myself on the stage in front of everybody. Are you crazy? So we did get young people who came from very high-class ballet schools, who 2 or 3, there were only 2 or 3 in a company of 200 plus. I was putting myself out there because I didn't know it was going to work or not. But it has worked because these are people who are under-resourced and they come to see all of this. They come to understand first the spirit, what it meant to pull these people together. In a minute I'll pull up a couple of slides to show you. It's not in this presentation, so it'll take me a minute. But what it meant for them to get that spirit and then to be willing to work with their hands. And now what we're doing, because we have to say to them, it's not possible for everybody here to be back on stage next year, the first 200. So this year we had 65% back, but that 65% had, as well as the 35% that had left, had been pulling in new people. And of the 35% that left, 60% of them went on to get full-time jobs, so they weren't able, we rehearsed 12 hours a day in the summer toward the show, which is the first weekend after September, and the others had gone on to college or were full-time enrolled in technical schools. So that 65% that we had brought in new people, and they then had to turn around. It's the old message from Art Show, had to turn around and teach the new people as we moved into it. So you guys keep talking while I find this. I'll find it in a minute. I don't know how I changed it, but whatever. It doesn't matter. These are slides I used in Denmark for here we go. Oh, I did the wrong thing. Why can't computers read my mind? I've been trying to work on this. They won't. But anyway, this was the closing shot from last year's show. And you can see the age and the age range. And you can just set it down there too from this year. But we didn't have but about 6 or 8 major actors with speaking parts last year from the community members. And this year that was it's fine. That darkness makes it really helps. That's okay. If I were at my desk, I could do it. But then what happened, and this was The Tempest, Shakespeare's The Tempest, and this young man did not have the metro fare to get there, we discovered, and so we had to provide the metro fare for him. And let me see if I can see this young woman and her mother But one of the things, again, Gay and I keep referring to the conversation Gay and I had at breakfast, we were talking about when parents and kids read the same YA books, they have something to talk about. Well, we had a lot of parents and young people because they were coming from Queens and all over New York. So if you're going to send your kid for 12 hours, you just will go with the kid, you know.
Right.
And so we had a lot of parent-child groups, young people, and the ages range last year from age 4 to 84. At the end, though, as we followed up, none of them used a cane or a walker. None of the elders. Now, this is from this year's show, which was Winter's Tale. That's in rehearsal. 12% of the participants this year were on the autism disorder spectrum. This is one of our youngest kids this year, who in one of the shows, one of the nights of the show, was turning around and doing some talking, and one of our most severely autistic kid actually was sitting next to her and put his arm around her and sort of pulled her away. And for me, that was the high point of the show. And fortunately, I did not know at the time, but his mother, who was a star of the show this year, saw that. And we both, when we talked about it, just wept. Because last year, that child, we had to have a monitor with that child all the time, because he would, whenever he was all on stage, he would get down, and before we knew it, he would be crawling across the floor and in the middle of the show. And so we had to have somebody with him to hold him back. This year it was totally different. These are some of the elders you can see that come in from Queens. This is P-Funk, one of the members from Fortune Society, which is the group of formerly incarcerated. This is one of my proudest. This was in the front page of the New York Times. These are the elders from Brownsville in their dance this year in The Winter's Tale. And they really pulled it off. We weren't sure they were going to be able to do it. It was a tough choreography piece because the choreography for the show was done by Chase Brock, who did the choreography for Spider-Man. So, and he didn't cut him in his life, trust me. And this is a domestic worker who was one of the stars of the show this year, and who is just, as you can see, absolutely brilliant. All of these women were in the show, and we only had 4 equity actors this year. And all the other major parts in Winter's Tale were played by community members. A foster child, 9 foster children, but you would never know. I mean, you would never know. And because Winter's Tale is basically all about pageantry, we had a surprise appearance of course, Sesame Street. So you can see the seniors and these are our little kids. This is the little kid in the background. The reason I can't show you a slide is because of equity actors, and we can't show films of equity actors. So in any event, they're only the still shots that are possible, and they can't have the equity actors in them. But in any event, it was a great show, and again won lots of acclaim from the New York Times. So anyway, the point is that I really put myself on the line, like, you know, you want to go out, Shirley, having slit your own throat. When I said, okay, here's the deal. We put it all together, and we see if it works. But it has to be sustained, and it has to be very, very high risk, and it has to involve the best. Interestingly, now we've offered them other playwrights. No, we want Shakespeare. Because nobody thinks we can do it, and we can. So it's actually a dilemma because the plan for next year is something other than Shakespeare. It's equally difficult, but something other than Shakespeare. So we'll see. Yes?
Great talk. I wonder, you had commented that parents were uncomfortable playing with their children.
Yes.
And I wonder, do you have some ideas of what's happening and why? Is it generational? Is it?
Well, I think 3 things are happening. It is generational, but it's caused by the economic situation and the bind on time. And as we know, everything has to be fast. If you watched the advertising last week, for Apple Pay. The main thing they said about it is it's fast. It's fast. It takes less time. You don't have to encounter. You don't have to engage with anybody. It takes less time. And I was saying today that when I checked in at Boston Airport yesterday, because I was coming from Boston because I have to go back there because I have to go to New York next week, I found that even getting your luggage tag for checking luggage is now automated. The only person that is involved takes the bag and puts it on the thing. And the only reason they do this, somebody has to check the ID before you get to TSA. So that is all part of, as I said, you know, we can't say it's wrong. It's all going to happen. We can't stop it. What has to happen, though, which is so surprising to me that people will not listen, is they have to pay attention to the research, not the, pardon my French, the happy stuff that's coming out, popularizing the neurosciences, but the research that's telling us what is necessary and what's happening. All we have to do is go look at the NAEP scores in terms of the drop in language abilities, in terms of syntactic complexity and lexical complexity across the range of what Catherine Snow would call the rare words of the world of sciences, etc. I mean, there are a lot of rare words, but they're not words that are going to end up in the science lab. But that being said, my sense is if parents simply took the technologies away from young people, except when they're, you know, I'll say 6, 7, and 8, when they're sitting and following up on something they've been doing together. The same way people, anybody here remember when their moms or grandmas bought encyclopedias from the traveling salesman and then everybody went to it? And I remember, I know people who said, I sat down to read it all the way through. Well, before they ever got through, you don't ask that question. But that's the way the technology needs to be used. So we have a passionate interest in insects. We have a passionate interest in revitalizing this 100-year-old house we're living in, and now that we've moved to Wisconsin, and we're doing this together. Or we have a passionate interest in cars or motorcycles or you know, funky cars or whatever, and we're figuring out how to get knowledge. We use it the way we use an encyclopedia. That's what I call play work. It's fun for everybody. Everybody talks about it, or you know, it can sometimes involve entertainment, but so often it's entertainment as opposed to doing something together. The other issue, as you know, if you've read Words That Work in Play, is the parents are constantly not taking charge as decision makers, so they're not modeling any of this planning or decision making. They're saying, what do you want for breakfast? So as Maisha was saying, she did this for about 3 days, maybe? Yeah, and then she said, I'm not a short order cook here. And I'm telling you what's happening for breakfast is oatmeal. And it ain't instant, I hope. Anyway, the issue, you didn't say ain't, that was my word. That's what I used to say to my kids. It ain't instant. But the issue is that parents simply have to take a step back and decide on their priorities. And say, you know, I've got to find the time to do this. How much time does it take to make oatmeal? And how much time does it take to talk about the making of oatmeal or to enable the young person to make the oatmeal? And as they get older, I mean, how much time? And do you not have a passion in anything? I mean, is there no passion? Is there no interest you can share with a young person that you love, your child? Can you not do that? I mean, I say this to parents all the time. I don't understand. Well, it's all about my work. Well, I wonder why you had children. And, you know, it's a very rude question, but I do wonder because most of us do work that we can't really talk about with our children. They never see us work. And we come home and it's all get it through in time, get it through. It's like Apple Pay. And those are the issues we can push back on. We can. And allowing no plastic in the house is another one. But I can talk about that. It has to do with the hands.
So I have a couple of big questions about play. I'm Julia, by the way, there, and I'm going to ask a question that relates to a project that Maggie and I started thinking about when we were in a seminar with Maisha last year, about the utility and the power of play as a way of understanding pedagogy and learning. And so my two big questions are, one is that since we started researching this, we both are in the composition rhetoric program. Is that I think I might be having that kind of classic researcher's delusion when once you start studying something, you start seeing it everywhere. But it does seem like there is something happening in the culture more broadly in these different areas about the powerfulness of the whole notion of play, so that in corporate culture they're using more gaming structures, they're using more team stuff that clearly seems to be about that principle. So I'm curious if A, you have seen that, or if that's just me. And then my second question is, I think sometimes there's an assumption that we know what play is and that we have a shared understanding of what that is. And so I'm curious to know what you see as the principles of play.
Right. The major principles of play, and if you remind me, I can give you a piece I happen to have with me. I didn't realize I had it with me on Play and Nature. The major principle of fun play, it's collaborative project development, planning, thinking, towards something else other than what is in front of you, and that is going to take place over time and collaboratively. So it can be doing a pie crust, it can be rearranging the silverware in the kitchen drawer, it can be thinking about what we need, it can be making a list by drawing all the items from the spice cabinet that we don't have. How can I draw allspice? I have no idea. I wonder if is it from a plant? Well, it must be from a plant, but I haven't a clue whether it looks like a nutmeg or what it is. So, this becomes, it goes back to the answer of the question, it becomes the thing you do together. So you can make play out of anything. I mean, the book, The Braid of Literature, that Shelby Wolf and I wrote together showed how cleverly children could turn children's books text into play, in which Lindsay made Ashley become the maid. She was the Cinderella and Ashley was the big sister, and it was all about sociodramatic play and those kinds of things where it's all coming out of the imagination, but it can be to accomplish something, and that's the issue. Now, one of the things that has come out of this change, to go to your first question about the gaming, is that there's some real pushback on that, because the gaming, it was people would claim it came out of the idea that you just let people spend 40% of their time kind of hanging around thinking, well, and doing games and stuff. Well, that then didn't work. So that pulling back into that collaborative play work is what more and more groups are doing, Yahoo being the most famous right now. But it's so difficult to get people away from gaming on their own games, if you know what I mean. And that's what young people are doing now. They're using a lot of video games. And people say to me all the time, well, my kid plays all the time, plays video games. And I said, well, a video game is scripted. It's not even like a checkerboard game. You don't know how checkerboard or chess is going to turn out. In the video game, you have variation, but that variation is all done by someone else. Now, if your child is learning to create script and to create video games, that's a different story. And there are some programs coming out of the MIT lab now where that is the case, but there are not many parents capable of enabling kids to do that. I certainly wouldn't be, but that's one of the things that is happening in music as well. So the gaming is a cover for play because they picked up on the play. Stuart, what's the guy who did the book about play? Maybe it's in this article I'll give you. It's something about play, let's do it, or it was one of those popular books. I mean, he's a scientist, but he's like everybody else. He wanted to write a popular book. As you probably figured out, I will never write a popular book. But the issue was, what is his name? Stuart Brown was his name. And he really talks about taking apart. Yeah, Stuart Brown, play, how it shapes the brain, opens the imagination, and invigorates the soul. It could have been 7 steps to play, or whatever. So the issue is that you're quite right. Play is re-entering, but it is not. it is being picked up lightly in most cases. It's very much the way the Providence, Rhode Island program to get immigrant parents to talk directly to their children. There's been so much criticism about that because the linguists have just come in and just screamed and yelled and raised Cain about it. And I said, wait a minute, what is the harm here? You've got to identify the harm if you feel that there's harm. These are people who are trying to take a set of complex ideas and work with parents to get them to think about what it's like to talk directly to a young child as a conversational partner. And maybe there is a kind of noblesse oblige attitude there. But let's be careful about condemning anything, because at least that is about talk. It's very much what happened when we began the family literacy programs that came out of Kentucky. And now it's turned into the National Family Learning Project, I think. Because I think they gave up on literacy and turned it into learning, which is fine if you haven't given up on literacy, because I don't know how you do learning without literacy in the world. Because as I said, you want to go to literacy forums to learn things. So you're quite right, but I do think that play in pedagogy and formalized environments is very tough to come off because of the fact that you don't have a fixed outcome. And that's the problem with play. That's the other aspect of play. You can't have a fixed outcome. Maybe the kid puts the knives in the section of the drawer that you might not want them in. And then you say, oh, it's funny, I've never put the knives there. Why'd you do that? Well, I don't know, I didn't think about it. Well, which one are you likely to pick up most often? Knife, fork, or spoon? Well, you might want to arrange them that way. But think about it, it doesn't matter to me. Because you can't be invested in a single outcome with play. I mean, and this is the problem. People talk to me all the time about sports, and I say, don't talk to me about sports. I studied sports for 10 years. I've written a lot about sports. Sports is not a bad thing. The problem is that you don't have open decision-making in sports. You can't say in the middle of a baseball game, let's change the rules. You can't do it, folks. You get in real trouble. You have to wear certain uniforms. You have to talk about it the same way. You have to know the same players. You have to know the same stuff. And it's not expansive the way learning in the arts or music is, where you get this whole full range of things. So, and there's a reason why we talk about in English, and that you say, well, come on, that's just an accident of English. But I always like to point out, it's why we talk about play music. It is the playing, because once you hear a live performance of music, you never hear it again. It's maybe taped, but it's not the same. The same is true with dance. It's one of the big problems for those of us who love, big dance on big theater stages. You never see it again. I mean, video is not going to cut it for someone like, or whatever, you're going to see. And opera's the same thing. I mean, there's nothing worse than a video opera in my mind. It's just, yes.
I just feel like the way that I'm interpreting what you're saying, I just find it fascinating. And the more you talk, the more profound it gets. And I'm like, wow. I feel like there seems to be a really important commentary about under-resourced homes, and the comment you made about technology. And I'm remembering in the 70s when researchers used to go to people's homes and see if they have count how many books you have in the home. Right. Yeah. And now it seems like people are like, do you have an iPad? In the home, right? Oh, because now school districts are buying school iPads for every single kid, and they get to take them home. Oh, yeah. Because every home needs. And they're doing it in third world countries, which is really, for Nancy and me, that is a really, really bad idea. But you're making me think about like the value, the undervaluing of play and imaginative play in the, given lack of resources in under-resourced homes and modest income homes. Yeah. I grew up on a ranch, and me and my sisters figured out a ton of ways to make play with mud. Oh yeah. That's what we did. Yeah. So it sounds like you're making at least the way I'm interpreting it is you're making this really profound comment about perhaps us, challenging us to rethink how we think about the relationship between technology, play, learning, and particularly for under-resourced students. And absolutely. And so many under-resourced families say, I don't know how my kid is going to get any advantages. We just don't have the technology. We don't even have reliable internet.
And I say, I'm so proud. Mwah! I love you to death. You're so lucky. You know, and when Anne Fernald did a study, and look it up, Anne Fernald, and oh, I'm blanking on her co-author. She's at the Infant Research Lab at Standford, and she recently did a study of all lower class Spanish monolingual families, all lower class, hear that, all lower class, right? Filmed them one day when the child was 18 months old, another day when they were 24 months old, and then did a language processing study and looked at vocabulary when the child was 24 months old. Guess what she found? Greater variability than we found in the studies which put middle and upper class parents with welfare parents. So families are variable. If you've lived and walked on this earth, you probably know that. But when you plan a research study comparing across classes, how insane is that? You forget it. And so what she found was there was so much variability, and that many of these families where they were directly talking to the child as much as 12 to 20,000 words a day. I mean, obviously 6 to 12 makes more sense perhaps. It was the direct talk, not the ambient language. And those are the children who did better at processing, that is, being shown pictures of cats, dogs, etc. Now we can talk a lot about the fact they were shown 2D pictures, not the creature itself, or a picture that would be a photograph or a stuffed cat, etc. That's all very much related to the neuroscience of the thing, but they did much better when it was direct input. And one of the things, you'll be interested in this, Nancy, is that because Nancy's heard me talk about the first year of work in New York, one of the things I've decided that has made such a difference in the language development of these young people, including our kids on the autism disorder spectrum, is the amount of direct language input. Because when you're sitting in a black box and you are watching Chase Brock tell you how to do this move, and you're thinking, you're envisioning yourself, your body, and you're moving. We know those motor cortexes are moving, and then you have to do it with 12 other people, and then you know there are 100 people behind you, and how you're gonna, when you go on stage, you've got to do it so that you're not kicking the person behind in those very fast-moving kicks. You're so engaged, but it's directly to you. It's not the kind of talk that they typically have gotten from guards in prison or in foster care or in homeless shelters or wherever. And it's that direct talk. They have plenty of ambient talk. They live in New York City, for goodness sake. But it's not the ambient talk. It's to me. I'm the one who's got to get it right. And with the seniors, there was one day close to dress rehearsal, panic, panic, when they just screwed up so badly, and I just thought, oh my God. I mean, I'm not in charge of directing, obviously, their directors, etc. And I thought, what is Lear going to do? Lear is the name of the director. But it wasn't Lear who did it. It was one of the elders who pulled the others aside, got them to practice and watch one another and pull it together. That's why they went on the front page of the New York Times. I mean, it wasn't that the others did it badly, but it was so spectacular. And it's the direct language input. Who talks directly to elders? Of poverty. Brownsville is probably one of the poorest areas in all of New York City. No one talks directly to the poor. You have nothing to say. I'm not interested. Why would I talk to you? I don't know what to say to you. I mean, that's the attitude. And so it's give them instructions as a general group, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas what was so different in the study Anne Fernald did was these were parents who were doing exactly what you were saying. Oh, we're gonna go to the store, I don't have any flour. Yeah, you gotta put I know you don't like putting your jacket on. I know you don't, but we're going to the store. We're going to the store, we're gonna get flour, and I'm gonna make cookies. But we got chocolate chips. We're gonna put the chocolate chips on the counter. And then we'll come back and make the cookies. Or whatever. And now, I mean, Anne says, quite rightly, to all of us who would say, well, wait a minute, it's an experiment. It's one day and then another day. So what are we going to count from that? But the point is it gives us a base from which to work because we don't know what the other variables were. Was there a television in the house? Was there a lot of noise? Was there an apartment in which there was a lot of noise? Were there lots of sirens? Were they near a hospital where they kept hearing sirens? What was going on in terms of the noise level? What was going on in terms of the number of people in the house? I mean, some of the kids in the orchestras that I worked with in Los Angeles, 10 people in one room. These are families that have come in from Korea. And they have a child who plays the French horn and another one who plays the saxophone. And another one who plays the clarinet. You think, oh, you don't want those kids practicing in the house, in the room. Send them away. But they practice with this ensemble 15 to 20 hours a week. So at least they're out of the house for that period of time. But, I mean, this is that, and the same thing with ensemble orchestral music. I'm talking to you. And what has been fascinating for me in my studies of these is, okay, string section, heads up, let's see. And everybody listens while you talk to the string section. Even those in the brass section. It doesn't pertain to them. And when they don't, we have roving players that move around, and all they have to do, and you're in the French horn, you're playing French horn, is just, that's it. There's no, stop that. It's just the touch, because we're in this together. You screw up, you'll be next. You brass folks, that'll be it. And what is so fascinating to me is it's such a way of learning, and it goes back exactly to the questions about play as pedagogy. It is this natural way of picking it up because you're part of this collaborative group that's got to get it right, because you'll be in the Hollywood Bowl or whatever. Other questions? Yes?
I found your work with immigrant children and refugees very interesting. So I was wondering, in the current situation that is taking place in the United States, where you have so many children crossing the border and they are facing, you know, a situation like that in the United States, what's your view on that? And how do you think, as a nation, you know, we should, you know, focus on this situation?
Ooh, what I would do if I lived in an ideal world and I thought Texas was an ideal place, I would go to all the museums there, which is basically what we did in England, and say, why are you having children, this is a little backup to your story, why are you having children walk through the museum when they're bused here by their schools? Well, we hope that they're going to learn to know our museum and want to come. And I said, well, do you have any evidence that that's the case? No, but we think that's probably the case. I said, well, would you be interested in learning that? So then we did the study of 3 hours after 3 days later, 3 weeks later, 3 months later. Well, nothing. Nothing was remembered, short of the 3 days later. And what was remembered typically was not things like the comparative analysis of the dinosaur bones in the Natural History Museum or whatever. So we said, what's your budget? And do you care what your bottom line is? Well, yeah, we spent a lot of money on this. And I said, well, why don't you take your money and put it into building open studios within your spaces so that people come and they study here for 6 weeks on something that's coming as an exhibition in the museum. And then we'll do some more analysis, and you won't be able to have 20,000 kids go through here. It will be more like 10,000. But let's try that. And of course, now all the museums in England have what they call learning departments rather than education departments. I may change the name. I really gave a big push toward that. But the issue is that you've got learning environments, and what museums are doing. At the Louisiana Museum, where I was 3 weeks ago, they have 3 floors dedicated to children, and children learning art, working with art, and doing art, and spending time in the museum. So what I would say in Texas is let's take all the museums, every history museum, every wildlife museum, every botanical garden, every site that is supported in part by public money and philanthropy, and open it up where we do ongoing learning studios with young people that are coming into the country and that they are brought in. And that's what 3 weeks ago, these refugees had just arrived. We had 1,500 orphans from Eritrea. Now we don't know what's going on in Eritrea, why there's such an from Eritrea. So 2 foreign ministers went while I was there to try to find that out. But they were there. They had never been in a museum, never held a paintbrush. We did this was my suggestion, as you know, my passion about the hands. We did a big white piece of paper on a long table, had them all around the table. There were no languages in common except a tiny bit of English, and one young man spoke some Persian, and we only had 2 girls who had come in from Syria, spoke the common language. And so obviously lots of demonstration, lots of moving. I mean, there's a whole thing we're writing now about how to do that. But we had them look at their hand and draw your hand without looking at the drawing. And what I was interested in, as I always am, is when I say draw your hand, are you going to draw your hand like this, or are you going to draw your hand like that? 99% of people draw their hands like this, whereas 99% of the time we use our hands like this. I find that very interesting. And so I drew my hand like this. Most of them did their hands like this, which was very, very much a Western thing, I thought, but of course I was wrong. So then we said, okay, and then now draw looking only at the drawing and not at your hand. So, and then you can draw looking at your drawing and your hand. And then, so everybody had 3 minutes. And then, you can imagine doing this. I'd like you to create a symbol that matters to you and connect the hands around the table with the symbol. Your symbol will connect to you, and to you, and to you. You'll have a symbol. So there were lines of red crosses, because the Red Cross had brought them in. There were lines of hearts, there were lines of leaves, there were lines of flowers. The 2 young women used flowers because they had not known one another in Syria. There are not many girls who managed to get out of the country. And so we had symbols all around linking these. We looked at those, and then we took them into the museum to an exhibition of the work of Emil Nolde, who was a German artist during the Nazi period. And his work varies a great deal, but a lot of it is very Matisse-like, almost watercolored, muted, natural leaves and woods that I could show you, except I'm not going to mess with this thing again. It's not on my desk. I don't know why. Space really matters to me. I can't. It's the same machine. I just can't work it in another place. But the issue is that we were in Louisiana Museum, which is the top contemporary art museum in Denmark, and it was on the shores of the Øresund Sound, and the leaves were turning, and it was a forest, and there 25 sculptures, Calder, Henry Moore, Giacometti, all over the place. So that we took them into Emil Nolde, just the watercolors, and had them do sketches. They had paper, and they were given first time they were given pencils. Then we gave them crayons, kind of like pencils, and asked them to do that, because we knew what we were going to do with it next, which was we were going to take it back down to the room where we worked, and we were going to wet it and mute it. You would not believe the work these kids did. They were so focused. And one of the things that the Danes kept telling me was, if we were doing this with Danish children, they say, why do I want to do this? I don't want to do it. Why should I do this? Whereas these kids never, and of course no language, I mean, very minimal. But as we use more language, one of the things we did that we do often in second language learning is we kept repeating, and we would touch. I had talked to her and I said, every time we touch someone, and always on a shoulder or an arm, somewhere safe. And we demonstrate, everything demonstrated 2 or 3 times, and demonstrated very quickly, not slowly, but very, very quickly. And this was something the artist did, and I was a little surprised, but it worked great. So that was one of the things, and then the next thing we did was take them out on the grounds to draw a piece of sculpture, but to draw a piece of sculpture in connection with something else that they really liked. So liking or smiling and showing, and so it's amazing how they all got it by looking at one another and talking, etc. And the art they did that day, of course, they were so proud of it. And then feeding them in the cafeteria. This has a world-class dining room. But that's when I realized, whoops, we weren't prepared for this, because there were a lot of normal clients, customers, visitors around, watching them cope with these forks and knives, and they knew they were immigrant, they were refugee kids, because Denmark right now is the only Scandinavian country taking these kids. But it is something that's very possible, and Shelby Wolf and I for 10 years did this in museums in England, and it is possible, but it takes imagination, and it takes someone who has, spirit. As Immanuel Kant said, you have to have the spirit, and that's what gives you the mental energy to be able to do it, which is what I think is very much true of play. We could have taken, it's interesting that Kant uses this word play in there. It is that play, and they were playing and they were laughing, and the Eritrean kids, who had come through such trauma to get there, and we don't know what's going to happen to these kids. They have to be, they won't take them in unless they know they're orphans, and they can't take them in if they're not for sure they hit. So if you look on a map and you look where Eritrea is, you look where Denmark is, you think, how in the world did those kids get here? How did that happen? We don't know. So, great question. Go to Texas and tell them to do it.
We have time for one more
Try
question.
the Houston Museum and see if they'll do it.
Thank you for your talk. I'm fascinated by the neurological aspect of the work, and I'm wondering, not having a clue really about neurology, could you tell us a little bit about what neurologists think it means when, for example, they say, this activates this other part of the brain that's associated with language or emotions, etc. What does that really mean? Does that mean that it's easier for someone to learn that? Or I guess I'm not really sure what it means to activate.
It means three things. One thing is that you never really know in the popular stuff what that means. Because it could mean blood flow. It could mean they're looking at dendritic pruning or dendritic associations, that is building new dendritic connections, neuronal connections, and it could mean something that is measured electrically. So we don't know when they're just using words like that. And I didn't take you through the specifics of what happens, but the issue is that one of the things that we are sure of is that practice builds these neuronal pathways, and those neuronal pathways, and this is now I'm talking about neurons and how they link, how they talk to one another, and that's what we want. And it's practice that enables that at an automatic level. So that's when in psychology, we talk about automaticity. And that when you reach the point of automaticity, so it's like people are playing the piano and they get to the point they can do what we call play by ear. Well, their fingers are automated, and that's one of the reasons that the brain looks different, is because that has been, in this case it was blood flow, but that looks so different. And the other thing is that it's not just a specific area, but it is the connectivity. And the connectivity, whether it's electrical or blood flow or neuronal connectivity, all of that is contributing to what for lack of a better word, we talk about as activation. But it is like reaching the point in running where you feel the endorphins kick in. And when that happens, you know the moment. Somebody has told you about it, you've read about it, but you know that moment when the endorphins kick in. And I cycle a lot, and that's why I feel it, but it takes longer when you're cycling. Because, and I tried to figure out why it takes so much longer when you're cycling, and it's because cycling requires so much more in the brain than running. And you say, well, wait a minute. Well, especially if you're cycling out in nature. I mean, you really have to watch for the stupid squirrels, or you have to watch for the stupid other bikers, or you have to watch for, puddles, or you have to watch for gravel, etc. So you are much more alert than if you're on a regular running path where you run all the time. And I tend to cycle different paths. So I don't get the endorphin kick. I get other kinds of kicks, but I don't get the endorphin kick. And I get the balance, you know, the balance stuff. But that's the issue, is that more is better, which is why play matters, because in play, it's the pre-planning, it's the pre-thinking. Oh, I've got 15 blocks of wood here, and they're all different sizes. And do you want to build a castle? I never saw a castle. You can make it up. You want to go look up a castle? Ye gods, I don't know how do you go look up a castle? I think you can't look up castle just as castle. You got to look up a castle. Huh. So I've got my, you know, whatever technology you got. And then I think, I know I got an old picture of a castle in Denmark. We'll go look at that and build it from that. You know, so that it is that hearing aloud. And again, I'm doing exactly the question that was raised about talking. I'm talking out. What are we going to do? How are we going to find this out? You know, I don't know. And not being afraid to say, I don't know. I don't know. Or I didn't, or I forgot. All those sorts of things. So it is that voicing which then enables the revoicing. Because I see myself in you. It's a bit like the YA novels. As you do it, I see myself in you. As a kid. Good question.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're out of time. Thank you guys so much. Can we thank Professor?
Thank you. Thank you for your patience.